Hey everybody, I'm the Drink Pro. Today we've got two different whiskeys from Ironroot Republic. What's up everybody? Kyle the Drink Pro here with you yet again. Thank you all for joining me. I've got a couple of fun pours today courtesy of Mike McAllister. Big shout out to Mike. He is the member of the Patreon. He's been helping me out for a while and you should too. There are a lot of great opportunities for samples, bottles, and a lot of cool conversation and extra video content. So check it out now, patreon.com/thedrinkpro. I've got two different whiskeys I'm reviewing today, but they're actually very similar because they're both from the same lineup. Ironroot Republic has several different whiskeys in their lineup, but sort of their flagship, from my perspective, is the Harbinger. I think I'm saying that right, Harbinger. Before we get too far into these whiskeys, I want to give a little bit of background about the Ironroot Republic Distillery. It's in Texas. Texas bourbon is on the rise right now. They have a lot of craft stuff coming out of there and a lot of hype around the Texas whiskey scene. At least conceptually, Ironroot has existed from 2011 until today. It was actually two brothers. One was an attorney and one was an engineer that decided to get... Stupid microphone, why aren't you working? One was an attorney and one was an engineer, and they decided to throw away those very stable, established, and valuable careers and get a little crazy with it. So they started their own distillery. And it took them several years to get an understanding of the process and of the legal ramifications of how to set one up and what they needed to get from sourcing and from machinery and equipment. It's kind of a big, expensive process to set up a distillery. Nonetheless, they succeeded and they opened their doors in 2014. Now, as soon as they did this, they became very aware that they couldn't do all of the other work of managing the brand and selling this whiskey and getting the word out there while also overseeing the day-to-day operations of the distillery itself. So who did they hire? No one but their mom. Marcia is overseeing the day-to-day operations at the distillery, but they kind of consider her the whiskey mom, I think, based on what I've read from the website, making sure everything stays in line, making sure people do what they need to do. It's kind of a funny title, but it totally makes sense in the context of this brand. So I will say I really like the fact that they didn't try to buy in to some other established name. They're trying to make a name for themselves. They're sticking with their story. So often in whiskey, people basically try to buy their way into a history, and they're not doing that, and I respect that. Now, Harbinger essentially just is a standard, straight Texas bourbon. But one of the things that they're doing at Ironroot that I really appreciate is talking about the different varieties of heirloom corn that are going into these whiskeys. Now, why should you care about heirloom corn? It's kind of the same reason you might care about heirloom tomatoes or other heirloom vegetables. When you have heirloom corn, you're going for a specific flavor profile or specific characteristics about the grain itself that might make it different from larger batch, more unicultured corns. So heirloom corn may be more expensive, but it also may offer unique flavors that you're not going to find in large whiskey distillery product. Now the Harbinger bourbon actually has 4 different varieties of heirloom corn. It has flint corn, bloody butcher corn, purple corn, and yellow dent corn. And then also a rye component. So it's not 100% corn, it is a bourbon whiskey. But it is kind of cool to see all of these different heirloom varieties of corn going into the product, and to hear that they're being disclosed is very interesting and fun as well. And that sort of leads me to the other products. So we have their standard Harbinger. It's actually the Harbinger XC, which is a quote-unquote more mellowed down version of a standard Harbinger, which is I think 57.5% alcohol. This one's 45. So this is their sort of broad appeal version of the Harbinger. Now, while the XC might be sort of a broad spec audience version of the Harbinger bourbon, I also have a version that's very narrow and sort of a niche market, but I live for niche markets. I'm actually really excited that Mr. McAllister was able to get me a pour of this because I think there were less than 50 bottles of this one made. This is a single barrel. It's actually the first single barrel that was selected by the distillery staff of their Harbinger bourbon. But there's also an additional bonus component to this. This single barrel is at 122.6 proof. It was aged for 39 months, one of the oldest whiskeys that had been released at the time by Ironroot. But it also was an experimental batch because it included Magic Manna corn. Now, if you don't know what Magic Manna corn is, you're probably not alone, but the unique component of it that you need to know is Magic Manna is often selected to make sweet breads, cookies, cakes, things like that. Pancakes is one that's often referenced. So think about the qualities of a sweet bread. Because to me, that's exactly what I want to find in a bourbon. So I'm really excited to find out if that component from the Magic Manna corn made it into the 39-month-old bourbon that was then released. For one day only. It sold out in one day, and it was a distillery-only release. So again, big kudos to my friend Mr. McAllister for getting his hands on this and then sending me a sample of it. Very generous. All right, let's go ahead and dig into this one a little bit. Now, this is the XC. It's going to be 90 proof. I didn't mention before it's actually 32 months old. So it's relatively young, less than 3 years. I have read some reviews of that, gave it pretty positive marks. And it's worth also noting that Texas is a very different environment from Kentucky. So 3 years in Texas is a lot more back and forth in and out of the wood for the distillate than 3 years in Kentucky. Now you can still smell some of the youth on this. It does smell pretty young. The grain really sticks out. It does have sort of a dusty corn vibe, which I get a lot from these sort of smaller craft distilleries. I think some of that is probably the barrel size. I didn't see disclosed what size barrels they're using at Ironroot, but I would actually be a little bit surprised if they were full 55 gallons. It's definitely got this sort of nice dried oak on the nose. And then cinnamon, a little bit of ginger, definitely getting that barrel spice as it starts to open up as well. This bourbon though really lives mainly on the nose in an oaky place, in an herbal place, maybe a hint of nuttiness, but not a peanut. I just don't get very much fruit from it. Maybe just like a hint of a orange peel or something like that. Or like a maraschino cocktail cherry. I almost get like a sawdust component from that oakiness as well. The baking spice is pretty prominent too, I will say. It's just not very much fruit, a little bit of a sugar sweetness, but it's almost all in the baking and the oak and the earth territory. So that's not typically my preferred profile, but I gotta give it a shot. So let's give it a taste, because sometimes they smell and taste a little different. This to me is over oaked. Which is hard to say because it's so young. But this to me does. It tastes like something that has been in a smaller barrel, that's really been dealing with the harsh Texas summers and winters. And I'm just getting tons of like sawdust on this. I do think that it makes sense to proof this down to 90 proof. This is my first taste of any whiskey of the day. And I do think that having this sort of introduction proof is really helpful. I think drinking this at 115 or whatever it is, it might be too much, unless I've already had a couple drinks for the day. It has a nice lingering pepperiness, which a lot of people love, and the oak very quickly moves from that almost sawdust vibe into a more traditional sort of wet wood, like a cedar plank or a wet deck. But I do think that the mouthfeel suffers from the low proof as well. It does feel kind of thin. And, you know, I understand why they might want to proof this down and broaden the appeal, because this would be a really great cocktail whiskey. That oakiness will show up. So if you want to not have a lot of fruit, not have a lot of other flavors, but just get like spice and oak as a predominant under-carrying flavor in a cocktail, this would make a lot of sense. I mean, honestly, it's not going to be my go-to. It's very mellow, it's very balanced, but it's all balanced on the wrong side of the scale for me personally. I'm going to give it one more shot, one more taste, but probably not my go-to. Yeah, and that third taste, I got a lot more of that grain component, that taste of youthful whiskey. It's a little bit metallic. It's difficult because when you're making Texas whiskey, you're stuck between a rock and a hard place of avoiding the over-oaked quality, but simultaneously pulling out enough flavor to overcome that youthfulness of a 32-month aged whiskey. You know, you don't want it to taste like new make, which this kind of does, but you also don't want it to taste like it's been, soaking in too small of a barrel and it just tastes like you're chewing on wood, which this also kind of does. I want to give this a good ranking, but I just don't think I can. It's kind of hitting the worst of two worlds for me. I will say that if you like an oakier whiskey, if you don't mind a little bit of new makiness, the price is right on this whiskey. A lot of shit that's in this kind of proof and age statement that's coming out of Texas is probably selling for $50. This is, I think, $35 MSRP. That I can get behind. So if you compare this to other $30 or $35 whiskeys, this is unique. That's a value add. To have something that's unique is worthwhile. Unfortunately, in my perspective, the uniqueness isn't necessarily good. But That's just one product, and it's not their flagship. It's not the star of the show. I understand why they're making a broad appeal whiskey. Let's try something that is designed to be something special. Oh man, the nose on this is phenomenal. I had mentioned before that doing that research on the Magic Manna corn made me hopeful that this was going to have some sort of pancake vibe or sweetbread vibe, and it does on the nose. I still definitely get that cinnamon vibe, but this isn't nearly as oaked, which is interesting because it's higher proof, and it's what, 8 months, 9 months older? 7 months older. So it's a little bit older, and it's definitely higher proof, but it doesn't smell, at least, nearly as oaky. Or as earthy either. This is firmly in the category of like sweetbread and pancakes with maple syrup on them. Definitely maple syrup. It's a prominent note for me on this pour. Definitely a lot of pepper on the nose as well. That hot quality of a whiskey that's 122.6 proof can show up in different ways. And this particular one, it's showing up like black pepper. Lots of cinnamon though, a little bit of ginger, a little bit of nutmeg. There's some other fun baking spices going on in here. I'm also definitely getting an almond extract vibe, a little bit of alcohol, but also that nuttiness that's very nice. And the wood in this is very hidden behind that sweetness and that slight nuttiness, so the oakiness is taking a back seat on the nose. Let's see what it does on the palate. Man, see, I really want to like this, but I don't think I can. It's just hitting a really bad spot for me. There's no sweetness at all. It smells very sweet. It smells sweet in a really nice way. But on the palate, it is dry, it is oaky, it's very nutty. This is one of the nuttier whiskeys I've ever tried. Not in the sense of peanuts, but in the sense of maybe like a walnut or a pecan. If you like mixed nuts that you have to crack yourselves at Christmas or something like that, very much that vibe. I kind of feel like I'm going crazy here because like bourbon that smells like that should be sweet on the palate, at least kind of. And it's not at all. It's drying, it's oaky. It's got a lot of great spices into the finish, like a leather, some sort of wood tannins, lots of black pepper. That's the thing, you know, it's complex, it's unique, but it's not sweet at all. And for me, that's one of the appeals of bourbon is the sweetness. Just to make sure that my palate isn't going crazy, I'm gonna pull out something that I know is sweet. This is a Larceny store pick that I've had for a while called Smooth Fruit. I love this store pick, but I wanna make sure that it's not just my palate, because one of the things I noticed was after that rye review that I did last week, I tasted the rye again several days later, and I didn't get that same awful funky aftertaste. Now, I still would probably review the whiskey the same way. You can check out the review right here, but I think that, you know, your individual palate can change throughout the day, it can change throughout circumstances, and it's sometimes worth making sure that what's going on right now isn't unique. And it's actually the whiskey itself that's presenting in an odd way. So let's taste the Larceny. This is at 92 proof, so it's kind of taking a step back down closer to the XC. But I just want to make sure that my palate still can taste the sweetness. So this isn't as sweet, perhaps, as it normally is for me. So maybe right now, my palate is a little less sensitive to the sweetness, but even still, I'm really noticing that there's a lack of sweetness in this Ironroot, for me personally. You know, going back and forth now, I'm starting to get a little bit of a black cherry, like a Bing cherry up front. But the finish is very drying, very oaky. I believe this single barrel was a $65 single barrel release. It's really interesting, it's unique, it's complex. A lot of the things that I would say are high marks for a promising or a delicious bourbon, but the flavor profile just isn't for me. Yeah, I'm kind of seeing the same problem with this particular release as I did with the XC. It's a little bit too new makey up front, grain, metallic, sharpness, and then the finish is a little too over oaked. It's got that dry, tannic quality that I often get from using my very small barrel to finish whiskey. If I finish whiskey too long in it, it starts to take on this very drying oak tannin quality. And I'm kind of getting that from both of these releases. So I can't really say anything bad about Ironroot because they're doing things the right way. They're being very sensitive about their sourcing, but I think they need more time. They need to figure out how to hone in their products. And maybe I will get one of their newest releases. Both of these I think are from 2019, 2020. One of their newest releases might be more what I'm looking for. They may have sort of honed in what they're doing since then, but you know, right now I can't really recommend either of these pours for just your average drinker. If you want something unique, or if you don't care about sweetness and you want an oaky whiskey as a base for something else, these are great to have as options. And they're not terribly expensive, which also makes me kind of more likely to say they're worth trying. It's worth buying a $35 bottle just to try it, because you're not going to be out 50, 100 bucks. The single barrel at 65 is a nice unique one-off to have on your shelf, but as I get more and more tastes of different whiskeys, I'm less and less inclined to buy something like that unless I specifically and personally know and like the people who are making it. So that's what I've got. Thank you so much to Mike McAllister for providing those samples. I appreciate it, my man. I will keep making these fun videos, and tune in on Thursday for my live stream at 8:30 p.m. where I will be tasting 5 different whiskeys at 5 different price points blind. And we'll see if I can figure out which bourbon is best and which one is the cheapest. Maybe you'll be surprised. I bet I will be. That's it for me, guys. I hope you'll keep drinking like professionals. I'm gonna blend these two together and get to playing, because once you're done being a pro, sometimes you gotta play. Cheers.